The chamber was already tense when Barron Trump leaned forward, his voice carrying that sharp, calculated edge of someone too young to know restraint but too privileged to care. He smirked, eyes narrowing, and let the words roll out like a blade, unsheathed. His reply wasn't just dismissive, it was dripping with mockery, each syllable. The air seemed to thicken, and for a heartbeat, even the clicking of cameras fell silent. The words hung in the air like a dagger, suspended, gleaming, daring anyone to reach for them. Barron leaned back, satisfied, his chin lifted with that unmistakable swagger of inherited power. He wasn't just responding. He was performing, throwing down a gauntlet meant to humiliate, meant to remind Jasmine Crockett, and by extension every American watching, of the Trump name and the dynasty it claims to represent. But across the aisle, Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't fire back instantly or let her face crumble. Instead, she stared, calm, unbroken, steady. Her silence became its own force, louder than Barron's smug jab. The contrast was cinematic. A young heir intoxicated by his own audacity, a seasoned fighter measuring her next move with the patience of someone who's been here before. The audience felt the polarity. One side whispered, almost cheering, for the shock value. The other side shifted uncomfortably, sensing the ugliness in the remark. And in living rooms across America, viewers sat up straighter, leaning in, because they knew they were witnessing something more than just another exchange. This was a clash of symbols, privilege armed with arrogance against resilience forged through struggle. Narration cut through the silence like a drumbeat. This was not just a reply. It was an attempted humiliation on a national stage, a calculated strike meant to define the moment. But if Barron believed his words had ended the story, he was wrong. Because sometimes the silence that follows is not surrender, it is the calm before the storm. And as the camera lingered on Crockett's still, unshaken stare, one truth became undeniable. What happened next would not only shift the energy in that chamber, but send shockwaves across the nation. But what happened next left the chamber, and the country in stunned disbelief. The weight of Barron Trump's words didn't exist in isolation. They landed in a chamber already divided, a nation already fraying at the seams. To some, he was the prince of a dynasty, carrying the same defiance that defined his father. To others, he was proof that privilege had not only survived in American politics, it had mutated, grown bolder, more brazen, and facing him was Jasmine Crockett. In only a short time, she had become a voice impossible to ignore. She wasn't born into a dynasty. She wasn't groomed for power. Her rise was cut from a different cloth, late nights in courtrooms, battles in committee hearings, a voice sharpened by necessity. Where Barron had a name, Jasmine had a record. Where he carried entitlement, she carried grit. This clash was more than just an exchange of words. It was the kind of moment that defines eras, the American story retold in real time. On one side, a young heir wielding his lineage like a weapon. On the other, a congresswoman forged from the very struggles dynasties often dismiss. The contrast was electric, and everyone in the chamber felt it. What raised the stakes even higher was the audience beyond those walls. Millions of Americans watched through screens, already exhausted by years of political theater dominated by families who treated democracy like an inheritance, people who worked double shifts, who stood in line at food banks, who sent their kids to underfunded schools. They didn't see themselves in the Trumps. But in Crockett's calm stare, in her refusal to bow, they recognized a piece of their own fight. This was dignity versus privilege, truth against mockery. And in that collision lay the heartbeat of a country asking itself a harder question: whose voices really matter here? Is it the children of power born into platforms they never earned? Or the fighters who clawed their way in, carrying the voices of those who never had a microphone? The chamber buzzed with that tension. Some lawmakers shifted uncomfortably, knowing the cameras were rolling, knowing every eyebrow raise and side eye would be clipped and shared online within minutes. Staffers scribbled notes furiously, already imagining how headlines might spin the moment. Supporters of the Trump dynasty whispered approval, seeing Barron's smugness as strength. But others, especially those who had lived long enough to remember other dynasties, other downfalls, sat quietly, Sensing the arrogance of the moment might be its undoing in the public, they leaned in. Twitter feeds lit up with reactions. Instagram flooded with quick captions. He didn't just say that, did he? Privilege on full display. And the story was already spreading, but the real shockwave had not yet come because Jasmine Crockett wasn't cornered. She wasn't broken. She was waiting. And the silence between them was less an absence of words than the coiling of a spring. For a fleeting moment, it looked as though Barron had seized control of the narrative, that his insult would stand unchallenged, etched into the record, as one more example of a dynasty bending the room to its will. But those who underestimated Jasmine didn't understand her history, and just when it seemed Crockett might be cornered, the tide began to turn. Barron Trump entered the world with cameras already flashing. From the moment he could walk across a stage, he was walking across one of the most famous stages in the world. He didn't choose the spotlight, but the spotlight never asked for permission. It followed him, unrelenting, because of the name he carried, Trump. For many, that name meant power, wealth, defiance. For others, it meant arrogance, corruption, in a dynasty that believed America itself was their inheritance. Growing up in town, Barron never had to wonder whether he'd be noticed. Attention was guaranteed. Privilege wasn't earned. It was inherited, sewn into the fabric of his life, like the stitching in a custom-tailored suit. He learned early that the Trump name carried weight. Doors opened. People bowed. Critics silenced themselves when faced with that emblem of dynasty. And yet, that inheritance came with an aura, a sense of untouchability. When Barron leaned back in his chair and fired his cutting reply at Jasmine Crockett, it wasn't just a teenage quip. It was the performance of someone raised to believe. The room already belonged to him. It's a smug grin, the narrowed eyes. The cadence of his words, they were echoes of the man whose shadow loomed largest over him, his father. Donald Trump had built a brand on bravado, on swagger, on the weaponization of insult. Barron absorbed it like second nature. In a family where dominance was currency, sharpness was survival, and so arrogance became his armor. Youth became his weapon. His words weren't careful, but they didn't need to be. In his mind, consequence was for others, or for him, there was always a cushion, wealth, power, name recognition. But beneath that aura of superiority lived contradictions. Barron was young, still navigating the tightrope between boyhood and manhood, but already performing as if he were untouchable. He leaned heavily on the family brand, wielding insults like a sword, yet the blade was borrowed. Sharpness wasn't. Forged in experience or struggle, it was inherited, passed down like an heirloom. The Trump shadow was both his shield and his prison. Every smirk he delivered carried the unmistakable fingerprints of a dynasty that thrived on spectacle. This contradiction made his words sting even more. It wasn't just arrogance. It was arrogance multiplied by the certainty that the rules didn't apply. When Barron snapped at Crockett, it wasn't just a personal attack. It was a declaration, a message that dynasties still believed they could talk down to those who had fought for every inch of ground. For many watching, it was infuriating. A nation built on rebellion against inherited crowns now sat captive to a new kind of monarchy, the political dynasty. Barron's reply wasn't just his own. It carried the echo of generations of privilege, amplified by the Trump legacy that treated politics like a family business. And yet, this arrogance was fragile. Behind the smug grin was a boy still leaning on his father's shadow. Behind the sharp reply was the borrowed language of dynasty, not the earned voice of independence. For all his confidence, he was still defined by another man's name, another man's battles, another man's empire. That fragility mattered because arrogance has a way of mistaking silence for surrender. When Barron smirked at Jasmine Crockett, he believed he had won the moment. He believed his words had landed with finality, that the chamber itself bent toward him. But those who have lived through history know a different truth. Arrogance may shine in the moment, may dominate the headlines, but arrogance, history has shown, always sows the seeds of its own undoing. Long before Jasmine Crockett's name appeared on the roll call of Congress, it was written on the hearts of those she defended when no one else would. Her story did not begin in gilded towers or in the echoes of famous last names. It began in Small neighborhoods where people worked hard, prayed harder, and still faced doors slammed in their faces. Where the promise of America often arrived late, or sometimes never arrived at all. Jasmine grew up surrounded by that reality, seeing firsthand how uneven the playing field was. She wasn't born into dynasty. She was born into struggle. Struggle became her classroom, and resilience her teacher. Every setback only sharpened her will. When others saw barriers, she began to see blueprints for breaking them down. Law was her weapon of choice, though it didn't come easily. Late nights buried in textbooks, early mornings hustling between jobs to pay tuition, the sacrifices piled high. She wasn't chasing prestige. She was chasing power of a different kind. The power to give a voice to those who had been silenced. To offer defense to the defenseless. In courtrooms, she found her arena. And it was there in front of judges who doubted her and prosecutors who underestimated her, that Jasmine discovered the sharpness of her own voice. She didn't walk in with the polish of inherited privilege. She walked in with raw determination, a fire that could not be taught. She spoke for the accused, the overlooked, the ones society had written off. And though she didn't win every battle, she showed up for every fight. Her work came at a cost. Personal life often took a back seat. Friends drifted as hours stretched long into nights. Finances were tight, the pressure constant, but there was no retreat. Each case was bigger than her, each client a reminder of why she had chosen this path. Rise into politics wasn't scripted, it was demanded. Community leaders, neighbors, people she had stood beside in battles too small for headlines but too large to ignore, urged her to take her fight to a bigger stage. They didn't see her as perfect, they saw her as real. A woman unafraid to sweat, to stumble, to get back up. A fighter who carried scars as proof of survival, not shame, and in Congress, she carried that same grit. A chamber dominated by men, many with pedigrees polished by legacy schools and family fortunes, was suddenly confronted with a voice that refused to be muted. She wasn't polished in the way dynasties are polished, occasionally. Unfiltered, but she was undeniable. When she spoke, people listened, not because of her name, but because of her conviction. Crockett represented something America desperately needed: authenticity. She didn't claim perfection. She claimed perseverance. She didn't parade privilege. She paraded persistence. That authenticity made her dangerous to those who thrived on appearances, and powerful to those who longed for someone who looked, sounded, and lived more like them. Her opponents mocked her fire. They called it anger. They tried to frame it as lack of discipline, lack of decorum. But what they missed, and what her supporters cherished, was that this fire was earned. It wasn't a performance, it was survival. It was what allowed her to stare down prosecutors twice her age, lawmakers twice her wealth, and pundits twice her arrogance. So when Barron Trump's words cut across the chamber, she carried more into that moment than a seat in Congress. She carried years of courtrooms where she had been underestimated, where she had been told she didn't belong, where silence was supposed to be her place. She carried the voices of clients who had thanked her with tears rather than checks of neighbors, who had told her, "Don't stop fighting, you fight for all of us." It was never about being flawless. Jasmine Crockett was human, imperfect, emotional, sometimes rough around the edges. But that was exactly what made her real. In her, people saw themselves. They saw the grit of survival, the courage of speaking up even when outnumbered, the audacity to claim space in rooms designed to keep people like her out. And it was this very fire, forged from years of struggle, that she carried into the chamber that day. The air still vibrated from Barron's first strike when he leaned forward again, refusing to let silence reclaim the room. His smirk widened, his voice louder now, laced with the swagger of someone who believed he had already won. He doubled down, each word carrying the weight of inherited bravado, as though volume itself could cement authority. He spoke not to converse, but to dominate, punctuating his reply with condescending chuckles that rippled like echoes of entitlement. Some lawmakers chuckled nervously. Others avoided eye contact, and a few shifted in their seats, uneasy with the performance unraveling before them. The younger Trump seemed to savor their discomfort, mistaking it for approval. He gestured casually, waving his hand as if brushing Jasmine Crockett aside, a dismissive motion meant to erase her presence from the stage, but Jasmine did not vanish. She leaned forward, hands steady on the table, her eyes locked on him with a piercing calm. Her voice, when it came, was measured, not raised, not rushed. It carried the clarity of someone who understood that authority was not in the decibels, but in the conviction. She corrected his mischaracterizations with surgical precision, every phrase clipped clean, as though she were back in a courtroom dismantling a witness's shaky testimony. Barron interrupted, throwing in jabs, laughing under his breath, trying to shake her rhythm. He smirked as if every interruption was a victory, every sneer a trophy, yet Crockett did not waver. She paused, let him speak, then resumed with unshaken tone. Her steadiness was unnerving, and the audience could feel the subtle shift, arrogance. Clashing with patience, heat colliding with stone, whispers spread through the chamber. Phones lit up as aides texted updates. Cameras zoomed in for the tight shot of Crockett's unblinking stare against Barron's restless fidgeting. It was no longer a simple exchange, it was a duel, one side fueled by mockery, the other by discipline. The tension was palpable. Every smirk from Barron, every calm counter from Crockett, drew the crowd further in. Supporters of the dynasty leaned forward with smug approval, convinced the heir's swagger was unbeatable. But others, veterans of political fights, members of the press, viewers at home felt something shifting, as though Barron's confidence was a fire burning too quickly, destined to consume itself. Crockett's body language told its own story. She did not raise her voice. She did not rush. She leaned in just enough to signal engagement, her eyes never leaving his, her expression unwavering. It was the discipline of someone who had fought too many battles to be rattled by theatrics. And that waiting, that pause between words, that unbroken eye contact built its own suspense. The audience sensed it. She was holding back, was gathering force, storing it, letting the tension rise higher and higher until the silence itself began to feel like a challenge. Every second Barron laughed. Every interruption he flung her way only tightened the spring. His arrogance soared, but so did the anticipation of its collapse. The chamber was caught between two energies, his desperate need to dominate and her patient refusal to be moved. Who would break first? The privileged heir, reckless in his confidence, or the battle-hardened fighter, calm in her certainty? And then Crockett made her move with a single devastating line. Asterisk, the chamber had gone quiet, like the final breath before a storm. Barron Trump leaned back in his chair, arms folded, his smirk still plastered across his face as if he had already won. To him this was entertainment, another opportunity to flex the weight of a family name that had shaped American politics for nearly a decade. But Jasmine Crockett didn't move immediately. She let the silence linger, let the words of his savage reply echo against the wooden panels of the chamber walls. It was a silence so sharp it cut deeper than any comeback. Could the cameras zoomed in? Crockett's eyes didn't blink. She wasn't just staring at Barron, she was dissecting him. And the audience, whether in the room or watching from their screens at home, could feel the anticipation tightening. Then she leaned forward, slowly, calmly, deliberately. Her voice, when it finally came, was steady. "Mr. Trump," she began. And the pause that followed was surgical. Aaron's smirk twitched. Just for a second, the chamber leaned in. "You may have inherited a name," Crockett said, her tone measured, sharp as glass. "But you haven't earned a voice." The line dropped like a hammer. A gasp rippled through the chamber. Phones went up instantly, capturing the moment, knowing it would be replayed thousands of times within minutes. Barron's face froze, the smirk stiffening, his eyes darting briefly toward the cameras, as though realizing for the first time that he was not untouchable. But Crockett wasn't finished. She pressed forward, her words hitting with rhythmic precision. "Privilege may give you a platform," she continued, "but it does not give you wisdom. And it certainly doesn't give you the right to mock those of us who've clawed our way here without it. Every syllable carried the weight of years, spent fighting in courtrooms, standing up for voices that were too often ignored. The chamber, once so noisy with interruptions and laughter, had fallen into a stunned silence. The cameras cut to reaction shots, a senator's eyebrows raising, aides exchanging quick glances, journalists already typing furiously.
One panelist
Shifted uncomfortably in his seat as though trying to decide whether to intervene or simply let history unfold. And Barron. His jaw tightened. The smirk was gone now, replaced with something more fragile, a stiffness that betrayed the crack. Forming in his confidence, he tried to interject, opening his mouth to fire back, but the timing was lost. Crockett had seized the rhythm. The stage was hers. She didn't shout. She didn't grandstand. She simply delivered truth in its rawest form. For some of us, she said, leaning closer into the mic, this chamber isn't a stage. It's a fight for survival. It's a fight for dignity. I will not let you turn it into your playground. The last word lingered. Playground. A reminder that Barron's youth and arrogance were weapons. But flimsy ones, the tools of someone who had been handed power, not earned it. The audience was electric. In the gallery, a woman covered her, mouth in shock. On Twitter, within seconds, clips began circulating. Subtitles bolded her words, "You may have inherited a name, but you haven't earned a voice." Hashtags exploded. Hashtag Crockett vs. Barron. Hashtag privilege meets truth. Hashtag mic drop moment. Even the captions wrote themselves. Privilege just met its match. That smirk didn't survive the truth, the 10 seconds that shook the chamber. Meanwhile, Barron sat frozen. He tried to recover, shifting in his chair, adjusting his posture, as if regaining composure could erase the sting of what had just happened. But the moment had already slipped through his fingers. Crockett, sensing the shift, didn't need to. "Say more," she leaned back, eyes still locked on him, her calm demeanor. A stark contrast to the unease spreading across his face. The silence that followed was deafening. Panelists avoided his gaze. The chair cleared their throat awkwardly, searching for the next procedural move. But everyone knew, whatever came next was irrelevant. The chamber had just witnessed a defining blow. The cinematic metaphor was undeniable. Barron's smugness, once so unshakable, was dissolving live under the spotlight. And Crockett. She stood taller than ever, not because she raised her voice, but because she wielded restraint like a blade, striking only once, but with precision that shattered the facade of arrogance. Narration cut in. In politics, words can build or destroy. In those 10 seconds, Barron Trump's entitlement collapsed under the weight of Jasmine Crockett's truth. The camera panned over the chamber once more, frozen faces, lips pressed tightly, an atmosphere so thick it was almost suffocating. This wasn't just a clapback. It wasn't just a viral moment. It was a cultural rupture, privilege being confronted in real time by lived experience, and for Barron, it was clear. This wasn't the stage he thought it was. This wasn't applause for his sharp tongue. This was accountability, raw and public. Crockett adjusted her papers, her silence louder than any follow-up could be. She had delivered the blow. The rest would echo on its own. Already news outlets were preparing the headlines. Crockett silences Trump heir with 10-second takedown. Barron Trump outclassed in stunning exchange. Privilege meets its match. Crockett's mic drop moment goes viral. In living rooms across America, people replayed the clip over and over, pausing at Barron's expression the exact second his confidence faltered, rewinding Crockett's words, letting them hit again, letting them remind a nation tired of arrogance that sometimes, just sometimes, dignity delivers the cleanest strike. And as the chamber slowly moved on, one truth remained undeniable: Jasmine Crockett had turned what was meant to be her humiliation into Barron Trump's undoing. The words had hung in the air like a dagger, and they had struck their mark. Cliffhanger narration, but even as Crockett's words lit up the nation, one question lingered. Could Barron, or the Trump dynasty itself, recover from this public unraveling? The clip spread like wildfire, Within minutes, it was everywhere, replayed on Twitter, spliced into TikToks, dissected on late-night shows. What was supposed to be a casual flex by Barron Trump had become something else entirely. A cultural moment. On the evening news, anchors didn't waste time. Tonight, Jasmine Crockett delivers a 10-second masterclass in dismantling privilege, one declared. Screens behind them rolled the viral replay, slowing down the exact second Barron's smirk slipped into unease. Social media was ruthless. Hashtags like hashtag mic drop Crockett and hashtag Trump checkmate trended for hours. Memes flooded the internet. Side-by-sides of Barron's smirk versus his stunned silence, captions like "when dad's last name can't save you." One tweet summed it up best. That wasn't a reply, that was an obituary for arrogance. But it wasn't just entertainment. It hit something deeper. For millions of Americans, this wasn't about one exchange. It was about what it represented. A rising congresswoman refusing to bow to dynastic entitlement. On conservative talk shows, hosts scrambled to reframe the moment. Some argued Crockett had disrespected the Trump family. Others claimed Barron had been set up. But the damage was done, the clip had been seen by too many, and the rawness of the exchange couldn't be spun away. Meanwhile, on progressive platforms, Crockett was hailed as a hero. Commentators framed it as more than a political skirmish. It's dignity versus dynasty, experience versus entitlement. And today, dignity won. Even independents, usually unmoved by congressional theatrics, weighed in. Polls the next day showed a spike in Crockett's favorability. The phrase "earned a voice" appeared in headlines, op-eds, and even protest signs. Late-night comedians turned it into a recurring segment. One joked, "Barron Trump brought a smirk to a knife fight, and Crockett brought the knife." The audience roared, and for Barron. The fallout was brutal. Clips of his reply, stripped of context, were used to highlight arrogance, while Crockett's counter lived on as a symbol of resilience. He had entered the chamber as the heir of a dynasty. He left it as a cautionary tale, but perhaps the most telling reaction wasn't online at all. It was in whispered conversations in D.C. corridors, the acknowledgement that a new power player had arrived. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just won a moment, she had shifted the narrative, cliffhanger narration, and as the dust settled, won. Truth was clear. This was no longer just about Barron Trump's smirk. This was about the future, and whether privilege could survive in a nation that had just witnessed its undoing. When the echoes of that chamber moment finally settled. What lingered wasn't Barron Trump's insult. It wasn't even the viral memes or the late-night punchlines. What lingered was Jasmine Crockett's poise, the way she stood firm, unshaken, and reminded America of something it too often forgets. Dignity has a power no dynasty can buy. For generations, privilege has tried to dictate the script of American politics. Names, money, and inherited power have carried voices farther than merit ever could. But in that instant, Crockett showed that a single moment of truth spoken with clarity could pierce through decades of entitlement. She turned mockery into a mirror, forcing the nation to ask, who do we really respect, those who inherit power or those who earn it? The moral of this clash was bigger than either personality. It was about the America people believe in. For immigrants who sacrificed everything to start over. For workers overlooked in boardrooms. For young women told to wait their turn. Crockett's takedown was more than political theater. It was validation. Proof that arrogance, no matter how polished, crumbles when confronted with authenticity. Asterisk viewers across the country felt it in their bones. This wasn't just politics. It was a parable. Privilege may grant a louder microphone, but it cannot grant wisdom. It cannot purchase courage. It cannot fake resilience forged in the courtroom, on the streets, or in the long nights of struggle. Crockett's fire wasn't rehearsed. It was lived. And in speaking with that lived truth, she revealed the hollowness of Barron's insult. What was meant to demean, instead, illuminated her strength. Asterisk. Narration rose like a drumbeat. This is what happens when arrogance meets its match. This is what happens when history's weight collides with one woman's voice refusing to bend. In the end, it wasn't Barron's words that would be remembered. It was Crockett's silence before the storm, her calm stare, and then her precision strike. That sequence became a metaphor for endurance itself, patience, timing, and courage. And so, the lesson spread. America doesn't need heirs. It doesn't need dynasties. It needs fighters. Fighters who come from the people, who reflect the people, who stand not on inherited names but on unshakable principles. As the days passed, Crockett's line was quoted in speeches, classrooms, and union halls. Students wrote about it in essays. Ministers wove it into sermons. Parents pointed to it as an example for their children that the measure of greatness is not privilege but persistence. And so the story transcended the clash itself, becoming something far greater, a reminder that dignity, once wielded, leaves a mark that no insult can erase. Cliffhanger narration, and yet, as powerful as that lesson was, one question remained. Would this moment simply be remembered? Or would it spark a movement? That answer would depend on what came next. Asterisk. And so, when history looks back, Barron Trump's savage reply will not be remembered as a moment of triumph. It will be remembered as the spark that ignited Jasmine Crockett's defining stand. A collision between arrogance and dignity. Between inherited privilege and earned respect, the image lingers. A young heir, smirk fading, confronted not with rage, but with truth. And across from him, a congresswoman forged in struggle, refusing to bow, answering not with noise, but with precision. That is the contrast America witnessed. That is the lesson it will not forget, because arrogance may roar, but dignity endures. Privilege may sneer, but truth cuts deeper. And when the lights fade, it is not the dynasty that echoes. It is the voice that dared to speak for those without one. To every viewer who watched and felt that surge of recognition, this story is your story. It is the story of every immigrant who fought for a chance, every worker who refused to be silenced, every American who believes that greatness is not inherited, it is earned. So here's the call. Share this if you believe truth speaks louder than privilege. Subscribe if you want to stand with voices who will not be silenced. And remember, the battle isn't just in that chamber. It's in every conversation, every choice, every moment we refuse to let arrogance define us. Because in the end, what happened in that room wasn't just a clapback. It was a declaration. A reminder that in America, dignity is not a weakness. It is the ultimate strength.